We're here at tour stop number 8, Varnum's quarters. We're almost done our tour of Valley Forge. And here we are at tour stop number 8, Varnum's quarters. Now, Varnum's quarters is dominated by the great big statue of General von Steuben and this wonderful patio where visitors can sit, relax, and enjoy the view out into the center of the park. We're at the north end of the interior line right now. The interior line extends down that way. And right now we're looking across the park towards the back of the outer line, which would stretch all the way that way. And the Grand Parade, as the name suggests, would be the parade ground for the Continental Army, and it would be the place where General von Steuben trained the Continental Army. We're going to get to that story in a minute. This stop, despite this big statue of von Steuben, is not called the von Steuben statue or even the von Steuben patio. The name of the stop is tour stop number 8, Varnum's quarters, because it's the headquarters of Brigadier General James Varnum, who commanded a brigade here at Valley Forge, and this is one of the last brigades that we're going to meet on our tour at Valley Forge. Varnum's quarters. When he moved in, General James Varnum used one room as both living quarters and brigade headquarters, and even held general courts-martial. The owners, David and Elizabeth Stevens, and their family were allowed to remain in the rest of the house. A large portion of their farmland was used for the Grand Parade. When Varnum's hut was completed, he joined his Rhode Island and Connecticut brigades, hutted on both sides of the road near the Stevens home, so this area will be loaded with huts. The exhibit table here gives us a good view of General Varnum there at the table going about brigade business. A simple floor plan for the house. And General James Varnum. And like every building, Varnum's quarters is closed, at least because of COVID-19. I'm not sure if this building was ever open, though, recently. And we have a useful sign here giving us the story of Varnum's quarters. A fine example of early 18th century architecture, this farmhouse is believed to date from as early as 1711. Note how tall and narrow the house is, the extremely steep roof, and the random placing of some of the windows. These features are typical of houses built in the first third of the 18th century. Although the house is heavily restored, most of the stonework and some of the woodwork is considered to be original. For decades, this house served as the main house for the Stevens family farm. During the time of the Valley Forge encampment, the house served for a while as the quarters for Brigadier General James Varnum. He was an officer of considerable military experience and was highly regarded in the Continental Army. Varnum commanded the Rhode Island Brigade, which had encamped near this house. Court-martials were probably held in this house with Varnum presiding. While it is possible that Varnum moved from this house into a log hut in February of 1778, this house is still typical of the small buildings in which many of General Washington's generals were quartered during the encampment. Imagine the crowded conditions in this house with General Varnum, his aides, and the Stevens family living together. Come to think of it, some of these windows do seem a little random, don't they? You have big ones on that side of the door, and you have little ones on this side of the door. And down there by the creek, you have a spring house. No doubt that's closed. And no doubt that was used to support the farm. And this would be, I suppose, the Varnum's front, the Stevens' front yard. Footprint of some other structure down there. I can only guess, it's only speculative. Maybe a barn. Now, about von Steuben and the Grand Parade. In the first couple of weeks of the Valley Forge encampment, Washington and his generals prioritized the feeding and the housing of his army. Indeed, little thought was given to anything else. When the soldiers were in their huts and the supply lines were more or less reestablished, however shakily, Washington was able to focus his attention on his desire to give the Continental Army a comprehensive, cohesive training. In this, his third major winter encampment, Washington had high hopes that there'd be a way to drill his army into a single cohesive force. This addresses another enduring myth about the Valley Forge encampment, that this first American army had no sense of training, with individual soldiers and platoons acting without orders or organization, either in battle, in parade, or in camp. The truth is much more complicated than that. The Continental Army, in fact, was not one unified army. Rather, it was a cooperative collective of the 13 colonies' 13 respective militias. Each colony placed a different importance on regular drill, and each colony decided for themselves which of the 4 or 5 military manuals available on the subject were to be used for the colony's needs. And thus, the New England troops would follow one training manual, the New York and the Pennsylvania troops would follow another, the Southern colony soldiers would have a third, and so on. The soldiers of the Continental Army were trained, but they were trained to deal with the threats that were relevant to their own colony, be it slave insurrections or Indian attacks, unruly mobs in the cities, or bands of roving highwaymen. Washington wanted his units to be trained like the British and the Hessian battalions that they had been facing, with not enough success, over the last 2.5 years. In those last 2.5 years, Washington had never enjoyed a real opportunity to mold his troops into the kind of force that he wanted. Starting in February of 1778, the Continental Army was about to get some of the help that it so badly needed. An unemployed German officer who was on the run from his native Prussia under persecution for being a homosexual, which was illegal in Prussia as well as almost everywhere else, and who was not above padding his resume. By this point in the war, both George Washington and the Continental Congress were wary of foreign-born officers who were coming to America and demanding high rank and pay in return for their services. During the last few months, Washington had seen examples of both winners and losers in this category come and go. It was true that Johann de Kalb and the Marquis de Lafayette were providing strong service, but Thomas Conway was also foreign-born, and he had recently attempted to embarrass Washington during the Conway Cabal. And the Continental Army's recent defeat at the Battle of Brandywine had been due, in no small part, to French adventurer Prudhomme de Bour's mismanagement of some of the most reliable troops in the army. The corps of foreign-born officers was a mixed bag of reliable and fickle. So we can only wonder what was going through George Washington's mind when he heard that yet another foreign-born officer was arriving in his camp to offer his services. Who was this Prussian general, Baron Friedrich Wilhelm Augustus von Steuben? First of all, Steuben wasn't a general. He had never risen any higher than the rank of captain, either in the Prussian army, and he knew that he was unlikely ever to do so now. He wasn't a baron either, and he was properly addressed as Friedrich Wilhelm Steuben. He was a veteran of the King of Prussia's general staff, the gold standard by which organized European armies were measured against. Although his rank was modest, his experience and exposure to the most sophisticated army training techniques in the world were going to prove to be priceless. Steuben did well in his job interview with Washington. Armed with a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin, America's agent in France at the time, he declared that he was willing to work without pay until he had proven himself as a drill master to the Continental Army. Steuben also professed an admiration for the soldiers that he was about to train, in spite of their appearance, which now bordered on horrifying. Yes, it was true that they often lacked food. It was also true that they were lacking uniforms or even intact clothes or shoes most of the time. Depending on the brigade and the state that the brigade came from, pay was often far behind. And it was also true that the Army had insufficient discipline, because nearly every brigade and every officer had a different idea on what discipline even meant. Soldiers were absent without leave often, and men often failed to maintain their weapons. These men were badly in need of the school of the soldier, and Steuben was eager to become their schoolmaster. What was it about these slovenly Yankee Doodles that impressed the Prussian noble? The answer was simple. What they were enduring was far beyond anything that could possibly be expected of any European army, including the British. European armies simply melted away when they were not fed, supplied, or paid, let alone had to endure all three to varying degrees. Washington's Continentals may not have been thriving, but they were still here. And though they were grouchy, they were often snidely wisecracking about their lack of food and supplies. That pay was often irregular and in arrears was nothing short of mind-boggling to this aristocrat. European soldiers simply went home after this. This was Steuben's first experience with volunteer soldiers fighting for a cause that they valued gratefully. He was thrilled at the spirit that animated, quickly convinced that such men could, if properly drilled and properly supplied, could stand firm against the worst that the British and the Hessians could deliver. Washington put Steuben right to work, and it was immediately obvious that this was going to be a team effort. Steuben spoke no English, except for the curse words, which he knew very well. But he did speak French, and so did his aides. Several Americans spoke French, as well as English, and thus all of Steuben's commands and drills would go through this three-way translation before it was ready to be barked at the Continental soldier. Not surprisingly, it took a solid month of dictation and inscribing for Steuben to come up with a uniform code of drill. By March, Steuben was ready to train the soldiers. He had but little time to mold between 10 and 12,000 soldiers, as spring was fast approaching. The solution to this time problem was a clever pyramid scheme, fitting, coming as it did from an unemployed mid-ranking officer whose talent was real, even if his credentials were not. Steuben drew sergeants and men from throughout the camp, including some men from Washington's own Life Guard, and formed them into what he called the Model Company. Then, throwing aside usual military ceremony, Steuben drilled the Model Company personally, which was unusual, a well-born officer behaving like a working-class drill sergeant. The plan was that once this Model Company was thoroughly schooled in the uniform code of drill, they would return to their units and teach what they had learned to their own drill sergeants. Steuben put this Model Company through their paces, barking out orders with an interpreter handy to get the message across. By all accounts, each day was an impressive show of Steuben shouting out commands, hooting "Gut!" in German when a maneuver was executed properly, and ranting, raving, and cursing in 3 different languages when soldiers were slow to pick things up. Steuben's techniques worked better than either he or Washington dared hope. The soldiers of Model Company learned their lessons well, and as planned, they dispersed to their various regiments and trained more soldiers. By late spring, the difference was noticeable. Washington's troops, now drilled with the bayonet, knew how to march at several different speeds and could deploy from marching formation to battle formation with swift precision. On Wednesday, May 6, 1778, the newly trained Continental Army demonstrated their newly learned skills for a proud and exhilarated General Washington, as well as a clutch of foreign dignities and Continental congressmen. In celebration of the newly announced alliance with France, soldiers marched by regiment, by brigade, by division. The grand parade rang with shouted orders, the squeal of fifes and the clatter of drums as all 15 brigades showed off their skills in marching and maneuvering. The demonstration climaxed with a feu de joie, the fire of joy, which is a spectacular stunt when the 10,000 men aimed their weapons skyward and completed a running fire of the line from one end to the other. We're in the middle of the Grand Parade right now. You can see the glitter of the cars from at the parking lot of tour stop number 8 behind me in the distance. And this is the area where von Steuben would have drilled his model company of the Continental Army. Here in the Grand Parade. The Grand Parade takes up most of the center of Valley Forge Park. Most of Valley Forge Park is this gigantic meadow. And this was exactly what the Continental Army needed to stretch out and to drill all 15 brigades at the same time. 12,000 men. It could only have been quite a sight on May 6th of 1778. When the rejuvenated army, proud of their recent education, put on a show for General Washington and the dignitaries. And this army's new skills would be put to the test in less than 7 weeks. The Americans would march out of Valley Forge in June of 1778. And 10 days after they left Valley Forge, they would clash with the British at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse. And they would put their new skills to use. Here in the neighborhood of tour stop number 8, Varnum's quarters, we come across some yet more cabins, an exhibit table telling us about the health conditions here at Valley Forge. Crowded and very sickly. Putrid fever, the itch, diarrhea, dysentery, and rheumatism were some of the afflictions suffered by the Continental troops. At Valley Forge, the hospital department inoculated 2,000 to 3,000 against smallpox. Medicine, food, blankets, and even straw for bedding were in short supply. All kinds of dirt and filth were ordered burned or buried. General orders in May requested that mud plaster be removed and huts be made as airy as possible, and the powder of a musket cartridge burnt in each hut daily to purify the air. As filth and offal accumulated in and around the huts, the number of sick increased. Washington continually issued orders to clean up the huts. The smell was in some places intolerable, owing to the want of necessaries or the neglect of them. On June 10th, the Army moved from huts to tents. At camp, the brigade hospitals treated the less seriously ill and those who were recovering from the smallpox inoculation. When the sick overflowed these flying hospitals, meeting houses and barns within a few miles of camp were pressed into service. The seriously ill were moved to the Army General Hospitals at Yellow Springs, Bethlehem, Lititz, Reading, and Ephrata. We have here a useful map of the Pennsylvania, New Jersey area. You can see Valley Forge and Philadelphia in black. And then you can see the general hospitals where the very sick soldiers were evacuated to. Bethlehem, Reading, Ephrata, Lititz. This resulted in very few soldiers dying at Valley Forge, but 2,000 soldiers died because of Valley Forge. The winter was over, and the encampment was nearly done, but the price of Valley Forge had yet to be fully paid. Steuben's training not only coached an ignorant army on a unified code of drill, but also pointed out a disastrous mistake the army had made when setting up the camp. Having just lost 3 battles against the British, the leadership of the Continental Army was in no mood to be attacked in their winter encampment. Thus, when the camp was laid out, the huts were positioned and oriented in such a way that maximized their defensive capabilities, but completely neglected hygiene and sanitation. The huts were located close to the defensive lines, both the inner and outer. That made for getting the men to their action stations in their trenches and readouts quickly and easily in case an alarm sounded. To keep things nice and orderly, the huts were also generally positioned with their front doors facing each other. Steuben pointed out to Washington that both of these attributes were wrong, very wrong. Having the huts near the defensive lines was useful, and having them face each other looked orderly, but it would have been far more healthful to have the cabins built on the slope of the hill, with all of their doorways facing the downhill side. That would have allowed for proper drainage of any water that made it into the cabins. As they were, the cabins didn't drain, and the water that seeped through the leaky roofs puddled and pooled on the floors. The wet patches became breeding grounds for microbes. Also, the soldiers themselves didn't have the proper appreciation for healthful bivouacking. They knew what latrines were, of course, but weren't always reliable in using them. Garbage from the field kitchens was often left to rot instead of buried. Waste from the hundreds of animals moving through the camp was not disposed of correctly, nor were the carcasses of the unfortunate beasts who died. With the dead creatures, the animal offal, the garbage, the indifference to the latrines, and the dark, dank cabins, the environment here at Valley Forge became absolutely pestilential. New enemies multiplied, and they were more deadly than British artillery or Hessian bayonets. They were influenza and typhus, typhoid fever, and dysentery. Epidemics of these diseases would damage an army in any circumstances, but now, in the last months of Valley Forge, the soldiers, already weakened and immunocompromised by months of malnutrition and poor hygiene, became easy prey to the germs. Thousands of soldiers fell ill in the spring and were evacuated to off-site hospitals, some of which were miles away. More than 2,000 soldiers would die of illness of the winter at Valley Forge, almost all of them in such hospitals. The vast plague-stricken campsite became so fouled that Washington ordered an emergency evacuation in the last weeks of May, when the weather improved. Warmer temperatures meant that the army could now live under tents, and the disease-ridden cabins were abandoned. The army marched off to the plateau that had been their home for the last 5 months and crossed the Schuylkill River to the north, setting up a temporary camp on the north side of the river. Let's take a closer look at them, and we will see for the first time what von Steuben saw. And we come up on our cabins, and we see, well, first off, if we get it back a ways from them, we can see that they're not really oriented with any appreciation for the way the hills are. We have the large meadow hill with some rolling hills, and we have kind of the foothills to Mount Joy right here. This cabin here is actually not too bad. It's generally pointing with its door to the downhill side. So if it rains, like it's raining right now, this cabin has a fairly good chance of draining. But its twin on the other side has the door facing the wrong way. And that's the problem with having a nice orderly log cabin city with the cabins and the huts organized into streets. If the cabins are facing each other, if all the doors are facing into the street, that means at least one cabin has got to be facing the wrong way. And if the cabins are placed sideways on a hill, it's possible both cabins are facing the wrong way and the water is simply not going to drain. In fact, with the moderate rainstorm we're having today, we have a bit of a pond forming right here. Now that water is not going to go anywhere until you get some sunny days and it dries up. Now try to imagine what health is going to be like for the poor 12 soldiers who have to endure in this particular cabin. They have a small pond waiting for them every time they set foot out of it. And when the weather gets nice and warm, it's going to be a breeding ground for all kinds of germs and mosquitoes. And that would be happening all throughout the camp. All 15 brigades, half of them on the outer line drive, half of them here in the inner line. Each brigade would be vulnerable to the germs that this would bring, in addition to the lack of latrines, or the lack of use of latrines and the lack of other sanitation features. Next to the cabins, we also have a cooking ring here, which also kind of serves to highlight that the camp kitchens would have been another source of germ problems, a sanitation problem for the campsite. Kitchen garbage, bones of the animals that were dinner, they would be strewn about. They were not disposed of properly. The simple fact is that of all the Continental soldiers and officers, very few had any experience leading an army of this size. And not only did they not know how to drill properly and fight in a coordinated manner, they did not know how to camp properly. They came into Valley Forge with a lot of blind spots and a need for a great deal of education. And Baron von Steuben taught them that. Later encampments during the Revolutionary War would go about much more smoothly. And a lot of it is because of the education, the practical education that von Steuben instilled in men like Washington and Wayne and Greene and Sullivan and Sterling and the senior staff here at the Continental Army. We're actually backtracking a little bit in the direction of Knox's, in the direction of the artillery park, tour stop number 7. And here, well, we come across yet another exhibit table. Appointed defense. On the attack, this would be your perspective. Advancing uphill, passing through sharp obstructions, only to face artillery and supporting infantry mounted in the redan. Brigade huts would be across the road just behind the defenses. These fortifications must have impressed enemy spies. The British commander, Sir William Howe, wrote home to Lord George Germain that the American positions were too strong to attack, with a clear chance of success. And these are abattis. In the winter of 1778, the abattis would have been a tangled mass of cut trees with sharpened branches facing towards the enemy. The redan is a small detached earthwork built forward of the main defenses to strengthen the line or to cover a vulnerable area. A little bit hard to see, but the redan of cannon is just under that big green tree. Again, this is the point of view that a prospective British attack would have on the inner line of defenses. That of course is after they would have battered themselves breaching through the outer line of defenses. Here we have a graph showing exactly where the relationship is between the felled trees, the abattis, and the cannon, the earthworks, the redans. And of course, the abattis would be here to keep the attackers pinned down for as long as possible and requiring them to suffer for a long time under small arms fire from the soldiers in the trenches. There is a redan full of 3 cannons just ahead of us. I'm pretty sure it's near that tree. We can't really see the cannons right now from here. I'm going to extend the selfie stick a little bit, and hopefully maybe we can get a little altitude here. Maybe we can see better. If not, it doesn't matter. We'll get a closer look at the redan. And we're coming up onto that artillery redan that we, the front edge of which we've already experienced. And we have our 3 cannons here. Okay, I think that tree right there, that green tree in the middle one, was the one we were looking at from the sign. So the redan here is a little bit off center here, I think. Or maybe it's this tree. I also don't know. And this would be part of the inner line defenses, just like the redoubt at tour stop number 6 would have been. In fact, if you look down there, you can see the parking lot to Knox's artillery, the artillery park, which is stop number 7. And stop number 7 is very, very close to stop number 6, which is the redoubt. So we would be on the defensive line from the redoubt, hiding in that hill there, making a line down through the artillery park, across Gulf Road, here to where we are, and back up that way to tour stop number 8, Varnum's quarters, and the von Steuben statue. Once again, you can see an awful lot of trees here, and there wouldn't have been none by the time these defenses were built up. And this redan, this section of the inner line defenses, would have been guarded by soldiers under Brigadier General Thomas Conway. That's his monument and marker, the marker for his brigade, right here. General Thomas Conway does not get a monument to himself. And now is a good time to talk about why. General Thomas Conway is so poorly thought of in American history that he is not even mentioned on the brigade monument that he commanded. General Conway was in charge of this Pennsylvania brigade under General Sterling's division. Commanded the 3rd, the 6th, the 9th, and the 12th Pennsylvanians. and General Conway did not command this brigade throughout the entire Valley Forge encampment. In fact, he more or less lost his job and came very close to losing his life towards the end of the Valley Forge encampment. Half-starved soldiers and completely starved artillery horses. If these weren't a big enough challenge for George Washington to address during the Valley Forge encampment, he also had to confront a hunger of a different kind. The hungry ambition of some of his subordinate officers for promotion and influence in Congress. In the fall of 1777, Washington's leadership was being called into question, as one might expect would happen to a commander-in-chief who had just lost 3 battles in a row, as well as the national capital. Some politicians in Congress were mumbling about replacing George Washington with Horatio Gates, by now the widely lauded hero of the Battle of Saratoga. In fact, this bad blood went far beyond Washington's recent losses and Gates' recent victory. In the Continental Army were several foreign-born officers who had been professional soldiers their entire lives. Washington's military record had never been so impressive. He was not a career soldier. He came up through the Virginia militia and had never had the professional education of his British and Hessian opponents, or even the education of some of his subordinates. 2 of them, Generals Horatio Gates and Charles Lee, had never been impressed by Washington's credentials and would have been all too eager to take his job. Another general who was unhappy was the Irish-born, French-educated Thomas Conway, who lent his name to the plot that plagued Washington at Valley Forge, the Conway Cabal. Historians are nowadays divided on how large a threat the Cabal represented to Washington's leadership, if indeed it was any threat at all. What we know is that Conway commanded his brigade well enough at the battles of Brandywine and Germantown. Washington appreciated Conway's talents, but not the arrogance with which he angled for immediate promotion. He disagreed when Congress promoted him to Major General, and again when he was assigned to be the Inspector General of the undertrained army. Conway's fall from grace was as sudden as his rise. As he prepared for his new job as Inspector General, details came to light of his correspondence with other generals. A letter from Conway to Horatio Gates that was critical of Washington's battle tactics was intercepted by forces friendly to Washington. In the military, openly bad-mouthing your commander-in-chief is generally considered to be a career ender. General Conway lost his job. Later on, it also came to light that Horatio Gates, while in command of the victorious American army at Saratoga, was perhaps not actually responsible for the great American victory, and the battle honors truly went to the American General Benedict Arnold. With that, the only real contender for Washington's position had his reputation sullied. Whether or not Congress was seriously thinking about replacing General Washington, or who they were going to replace him with, is still a matter of historical speculation. Whatever the real threat was, it came and went as the American soldiers drilled in the snow and the mud of Valley Forge. The final chapter of Thomas Conway's service to the Continental Army is a grim one. One of Washington's loyal generals from Pennsylvania, John Cadwalader, whom we met up at the Pennsylvania columns, at one point decided that he had simply had enough of Thomas Conway and challenged the man to a duel. Cadwalader won, sending his bullet into Conway's mouth. Conway was convinced for a time that this was going to be a mortal wound, and as he was recovering, he wrote a very humble, very apologetic letter to George Washington, apologizing for any wrongs he had done him and calling him a great and good man. Then he resigned from the Continental Army to recover, and when he recovered, he returned to France. And both the Continental Army and George Washington were rid of one of their many, many problems. Now we're coming up on the last stop of our tour right now. We just checked out the von Steuben statue. We've actually wandered a lot from tour stop number 8. Tour stop number 8, there's not much to see at tour stop number 8 except for Varnum's quarters. but it does give you, it is the starting point of a whole bunch of, to discover a whole bunch of trails, such as Conway's Brigade here, and the little clutch of huts there. And I showed you the Grand Parade, which was down right about here. We're going to come up to our last stop, which is the Washington Memorial Chapel. Tour stop 9 is the Washington Memorial Chapel, and it's probably the most unusual tour stop at this or any national park. In fact, if we zoom in right here, we can see that the chapel is actually not part of the national park. The chapel was here before the national park. If you remember from the beginning of the tour, Valley Forge became a national park in 1976. It was signed into law by President Gerald Ford. The Washington Memorial Chapel was here before that. And so they built the park, which is, you can see all this green, around the chapel, which you can see is this white square right in the middle of it. So you have a religious square in the middle of a public green park, which is not something you find in very many national parks.